finally got this thing working. Sorry about the delay, guys. Not happy about that. Something is going on the internet side of things. And why is the camera not moving? Is that any better now? There we go. Okay. That's how long the delay is. Okay. All right. So, I know that this has been a pain in the royal ass tonight. And I'll wait to see if anybody shows up now that I am fully 20 minutes late. Um, uh, yeah, so we're gonna plan on having the hangout tonight, and I was just going to do it on the simple, just stream it from my phone because haven't been happy with the giant setup I've been using the DSLR and the big microphone, but internet connection just didn't like me. So, but if you're here watching, say hi, and we'll talk horns and Wagner Tuben tonight. And of course, if there's not going to be anybody else show up, but yep. So I am happy to announce that I finally finished Volume 3 of Band Orchestration a couple days ago. The file has been uploaded. It's been sent to the printer. And I just got, as I started doing this stream, the notification that it has been approved. And so I will be able to order that here in the next couple days, have the first print copy in hand, and the copies of Band Orchestration Volume 3 will be going out next week. If hopefully, fingers crossed, as soon as I approve the first printing. Okay. Hello, Esther, Jared, and Helicopter. Esther, was that you that sent me the Facebook request earlier this week under the name Contrabass Serpent? That one left me a bit confused. But anyway, yeah. Yep, so the books, volumes 1, 2, and 3 are done. I am excited to be able to see the finished product of Volume 3 in hand. Hopefully, probably early next week. I'm going to have to order it, and we'll see how that goes. But yeah. So we're going to talk horns and Tuben tonight. There's probably not too much to say about horns. So we'll just go ahead and I'll open up any questions anybody has. Hey, Pucolo, sorry it took so long to get this started. Is Buddy just a Canadianism? Because that's not, it's interesting just the differences between regional or even country dialects, because we really don't use buddy here. Buddy is one of those that implies you're really good friends with them. It's one of those words that is a little uncomfortable. But anyway, Yeah, so horns and Tuben tonight. And let's go ahead and just start with our horns. For me, horns were probably the most difficult instrument to really get a grasp of writing for in either an orchestral or a wind band situation. Um, and I'm not sure exactly why that is. Okay, good question. Is it okay to use bass clef for low horn parts in band music? Absolutely. Assuming you're writing for an upper level band, you're not going to be writing bass clef stuff for um, a younger band because you don't typically need it. If you're going any below a written C3, that's the C an octave below middle C, then you absolutely have to use bass clef. Your horn players will thank you much. If you could write the whole part and it looks nice in bass clef, keep it there. One thing you don't want to do is have ledger lines above the bass clef. That's when you want to switch it back over to treble clef. If it's going back and forth between bass and treble, figure out, is it easier to just write the whole thing in treble? I have never met a horn player who didn't hate Sousa. That is accurate. And I talk about that in the upcoming Volume 3. Sorry to hear that, Thomas. Yeah, and Pugalo, I talk about the dreaded horn upbeat parts in Volume 3, and I say this is something that really should be relegated to the past. Particularly, just that kind of writing, that chuck, chuck, chuck. It's so cliched. Unless you want to evoke the sound of the 1890s of a band, you don't need it. Sorry, sweeter. Yeah, I had to start the live stream about 5 times before I got something to work. So yeah, horn players do not like the traditional American style marches. Why are they called French horns if they're not French? Okay. So let's talk about this term French horn, and I do address it in the book. There is a true French horn. It is a piston valve instrument with an ascending third valve. So first valve is your typical lowers a whole tone. Second valve lowers a semitone. Third valve raises the instrument up a whole tone. And that is a true French horn. And I do not know exactly why the term French horn took off in the United States, but it did. It could be that the term French just made it sound more cultured. We've seen that before. This isn't just an American horn, this is a French horn. Even though all the horns being used were German in origin. So, the term French horn is just this weird anomaly. Alto horns will give cleaner upbeats anyway. Yeah, but why are people still writing stuff that has these just god awful upbeats? I mean, it's shitty writing if you're going boom, cha, da, 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 da. It's not fun for anybody to play. And to be honest, you are not going to typically have a group that will mix horns and alto horns in the same group. Very, very rarely. I'm trying to think if I know. There are a few pieces where you will have horns and alto horns together. Something like Schmidt's Dionysiacs will have. It's got 2 horns and 3 alto horns. My Symphony 2, of course, has 6 horns and 2 alto horns and 2 baritone horns. But just stop writing upbeats. The march is dead. Write something better. Alright, so I'm not a fan of the form. No, there are good marches. Uh, Two of my favorite marches do not have upbeats in them at all. Granger's Children's March, no upbeats in sight. Hindemith's March from Symphonic Metamorphosis on themes of Carl Maria von Weber does not have upbeats. So where this idea of upbeats comes from is just this very strict American style march. Sousa is a big culprit there, carried on by K.L. King, and probably you'll see it in some of the British marches too, like Kenneth Alfred. Yeah, speaking of marches too, Texas is very weird in that every band competition, concert band competition, requires that every band play a march from 7th grade on through 12th grade, and it just said, you play a march no matter what, period, end of story, amen. And so we get this idea that the march is the be all end all. And it fuels a never ending need for a stream of new marches, but yeah. Okay, so horns. Typical. That's what we're talking about is the military style marches. And particularly, it's the American style military marches because German military marches don't have that. French don't have military marches. Italians do, but I don't think the upbeats are as prevalent. So it's really just an American thing. All right, so let's talk horns within the wind band. And I think probably the biggest thing to talk about for me is score placement. There is a huge controversy in where do you place the horns in a concert band score. So if we go orchestral route, so the orchestral score is flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, horns, trumpets, trombones, tuba. Easy enough. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Horns are on top. They connect the woodwinds and the brass. Sometime in the middle of the 1900s, and I'm not sure exactly when, somebody in the band publishing world decided it would be a good idea to flip the horns and the cornets and trumpets. So the brass section now goes, we'll just put cornets and trumpets together. So trumpets, horns, trombones, tuba. Which, if you're thinking of the brass as a cohesive group, makes sense. But it divorces the horns from their historic usage in that they no longer bridge the brass to the woodwinds. They're just firmly now brass. All right. When I was in school for yearly district festival, we could play a march or a chorale for the first tune, but no one played chorales because it exposes intonation problems so openly. Interesting. Where was that? What region? Because in Texas, you have your 3 pieces you have to choose from for UIL. One of them is a march, period, end of story, amen. And then you've got 2 grade appropriate. Horn is part of the woodwind quintet. Okay, pet peeve. It is not a woodwind quintet. It is a wind quintet. I'm not sure when it got changed to woodwind quintet, but the proper term is it's a wind quintet. Which it's always been since the days of Anton Reicha. Horns are very distinct from the trumpets, trombones, timbre-wise. Yeah, that's the point. Trumpets and trombones are the same instrument if you discount the difference between valves and slides. And literally the name trombone is just Italian for big trumpet. So there's not a huge distinction between a trumpet and trombone sound. Horn is the odd man out in every case within the brass section. It's the only instrument that's regularly called on to play all the way up to its 16th partial. It's the only one to have a disproportionate mouthpiece to the length of tube. So, if you don't know this, the horn is the exact same length as the bass tuba. But the mouthpiece of the horn is the smallest mouthpiece of any of the brass instruments, smaller even than the trumpet. And that disparity between the length of a minimum of 12 feet to a tiny mouthpiece is what gives the horn its heroic sound. It's forcing those upper partials through such a long tube. And no other instrument in the brass section does that, with the exception of Wagner Tuben, which we'll talk about in a little while. And the only reason for that is Wagner Tuben are simply modified horns. Yeah, so that makes sense, of course. Yeah. So, oh, one thing, as always, there's something like a 20-30 second delay on everything. So when I talk, there's a 20-second delay to when you hear it, and then there's probably another 20-second delay coming back. So that's just standard fare for YouTube live streams, from what I understand. Anyway, so yeah, so back to score placement. So you got these two schools of thought. Do horns go at the top of the brass section, or do horns go underneath the trumpets? If you're thinking of the brass section as a cohesive unit, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, which would be trumpet, horn, trombone, tuba, then you would probably put your horns underneath the trumpets. However, if you're not thinking of your brass section as a cohesive unit, and you're thinking of the horns as the bridge to the woodwinds, it does need to go horn, trumpet, trombone, tuba. And the trumpet, trombone, tuba really makes sense pairing wise, and you don't really want to split the trumpet and trombone sounds. So because you don't really want to split the trumpet and trombone sounds, there is one score. It's the Hindemith Symphony in B flat that goes trumpet, trombone, horn, tuba. And surprisingly, that if you think about that logically, it does make sense. He includes cornets in this, so it's actually cornets, trumpets, trombone, horn, tuba. But that's the only exception to that rule. Me personally, I always use orchestral score placement. So it's always horns on top, followed by cornets, trumpets, trombone, tuba. And that's the position I advocate in the book, though I talk about it in detail going both ways, and it always has to follow the function of the music. Personally, I kind of treat the horns as separate from the brass section in general, and separate from the woodwind section. So the horns are just kind of this solitary unit. It's the only group of the brass that traditionally will have four parts, so you can get this nice four-part harmony. And it's really, in the orchestra, the only wind section that always has four parts as well. Some of the woodwinds will get up to four, but if you've got four woodwinds to a part, then you're dealing with a big piece. And typically, you actually will have more horns than that. So, good case there is something, woodwinds in four, so it's a total of 16 woodwinds. In the planets, he Holst bumps the horns up to 6. All right, hey, Sans the Skeleton, sounds like you got a comment coming. So that's typically, with that colon. But yeah, so in all my scores, horns always are in between the woodwinds and the heavy brass. And I like that term, heavy brass, and it's a term that I kind of steal from Norman Del Mar. If you have an alto trumpet or alto trombone, you could try and put the horns in the middle. That really confuses things. Yes, Well, that's if you're using an alto trombone, really go and look at some of the scores of Beethoven and Schumann who are using the alto trombone. Particularly, look at something like Schumann's Third Symphony, the Fourth Movement, where he's using the alto trombone in there, and it's a lot of times doubling the first horn. Um, and it's a real nice bridge between the trumpets and the trombones. But back then, you also have to realize that your trumpets are not fully chromatic either, so you're dealing with natural trumpets. Um, if you want to look at scores where you do have the alto trombone and you've got chromatic trumpets, it's actually pretty minimal, and I would suggest going and looking at Schoenberg's Pelléas and Melisande. Absolutely fantastic piece. It's just sumptuous in its scoring. And Schoenberg has a 5 trombone section there, alto, and then 5 tenor basses. As far as alto trumpet, though, alto trumpet is so rarely used and so unusual that I could list off maybe 10 total scores that use alto trumpet, and they're using it in a very different way. It's really a lower solo trumpet, so that the tessitura is just put lower. Would you put flugels with tubas? Yes, I would, because flugels are tubas. And okay. So yeah, flugels are simply soprano tubas, and this is well documented, and it goes back to sax horns and the myth that sax horns are so complicated that I'm going to spend the entire next hangout discussing sax horns. So hang on to that idea. Next week we will talk cornets and sax horns. Um, and for fully expanded brass, horns, Wagner Tuben, cornets, alto horn, baritone horn, trumpets, trombone, flugel, mellow, euphonium, tuba. Okay, so fully expanded brass section. Okay, horns, yeah. So horns, they're fine. Wagner Tuben. Typically, when you have Wagner Tuben, they're doubles of your lower horn parts. So if you score for 8 horns, you'll have the lower 4 horns, 5 through 8, double on the Tuben. Cornets, alto horn, baritone horn are one family, and it's basically it's your alto and your tenor cornet basically. Trumpets, trombones, again one family. Flugel, mellow, euphonium, tuba. Okay, so mellophone is this weird thing. Okay, so so the next 2 comments are alto horn, mellophone, redundant. Yes and no, and they will cover the same part, but they do have different structures to them. So if you look at the differences in the mouthpieces, and this is where you can notice it most apparent. The mellophone mouthpiece is typically based on it's about trumpet size, but the cup shape of it is a very narrow funnel that is just essentially a larger flugelhorn mouthpiece. And you can look at this on graphs on mouthpiece manufacturers. Canstool, before they went out of business, was kind of the go-to on this. And I would look at the Canstool specs, and they may still have them up on their website. The alto horn mouthpiece is designed very differently. It's going to be actually considerably bigger, and it's going to have a deeper cup. So it's actually designed more on the cornet mouthpiece. Also, if you look at a cornet mouthpiece and a flugelhorn mouthpiece, typically the cornet mouthpiece is a little bit bigger. Flugelhorn mouthpieces are surprisingly small. Yeah, mellows are pretty much alto tubas. And again, I go back and forth on this. They're not true alto tubas. And this is one of those instruments that I am going to will into existence one day. a fully compensating four valve alto euphonium, basically. And I'll get to that at some point. But yeah, so let's get back to horns and Wagner Tuben. And let's just continue on with horns. Horns are interesting in that they're the only instrument in the orchestra or the band that does not have a family of instruments to go with them. And this is really, if you think about it, highly unusual. Now there are instruments like descant horns that will allow the players to play a little bit higher, but you don't see them. Does the distinction between a single or double horn matter when scoring? No, it does not. Single horns are kind of a dying thing. Pretty much everybody uses double horns now. And I'll tie this into Helicopter, who says, how often are triple horns used? The only players who use triple horns are some principal players in orchestras will use them occasionally for certain repertoire. They may not use them all the time. The thing is, triple horns are extremely heavy. Adding that third set of slides to the instrument, the horn already is, it's not light, but it's not, that heavy. But once that third set of slides is on there, it does get to be a very heavy instrument. And if it's in a long concert, you start feeling the weight. Where a triple horn might be used is if you're doing the Schumann's Concertstücke that has just this incredibly insane first horn part, but only the first horn player would use a triple. Triple horns are rare and inconsistent in either having a descant in F or E flat or a bass B flat. There are no triple horns with a bass B flat. I can pretty much guarantee that. And we'll talk about bass B flat here in a second. Do you think a bass horn as a bass to the cornet choir in E flat would be a good extension? I don't see why not. It would be an interesting experiment. It's mostly left to the player to decide switch size or double horn. Triples are very heavy. Yeah. So, yeah, it's up to the player. When you're writing for horn, you just kind of know the basic range and say, okay, yep, you guys can play this within this range here. There are some interesting passages that baffle me, and one that I was working on that I came across in the book is there's an extremely low horn passage in the beginning of Mahler's Third Symphony. Mahler's Third Symphony is fantastic for horns. It opens with this giant 8-horn unison. Bum, 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 bum. And then it just dies away into a 4-part chorale for 8 horns. The bottom parts, horns 6 and 8, go all the way down and to a sounding A1. So it would be sounding 3 ledger lines below the bass clef. Now, he's writing in old notation, so it's actually written as the E below that. In modern notation, it'd be written as E2, right below the bass clef. A single horn can't play that note because a single horn bottoms out at F sharp, just above that. And Mahler is writing Symphony 3, 1898, 1899. And so this is before double horns are really common. A few had been made, but not many. So we don't even know how the horn players would have been playing these extra low notes, but they're there. Pedal notes on horns are the weirdest textures in the winds. I like pedal tones on horns. I will. Now, so in my music, you'll find I do write down to F, a low written F, quite frequently for 4th horn. And when we were doing my piece Fairyland, I'll tell the full story of the fourth horn part here. That part does go all the way down there, and occasionally I've written down. I think the lowest I've written is an E flat below that. So thumb in one, and it would sound the A flat down right below the bass clef. Um, but anyway, the fourth horn story on Fairyland, and this was really not a good situation. Um, we had all four horn players ready to go. We'd been practicing. Um, and then two rehearsals before the concert, fourth horn player doesn't show up. Now it's weird because the fourth horn player and the second horn player are brothers. And so one's there, one's not. It was like, what's going on? And it turns out the fourth horn player had been rushed to the hospital, and thought, okay, well, yeah, he'll be there next rehearsal next week. No biggie. He said that as much in a text to me. Well, turns out Monday comes around. Monday's the next rehearsal. The concert's Thursday. I get an email. Yeah, I got diagnosed with cancer. I'm not going to be able to be at the concert. It was one of those, there's nothing you can do and say, yeah, I got cancer. So that was the story there. So the fourth horn part of that piece didn't get played. Everything else did, but not fourth horn. Sweeter than anything, I'm going to assume that you are a horn player. And I'm going to ask a question. How low can you play in the pedal range? Because when we were doing some of the rehearsals, one of the horn players just picked up the horn and was able to play an open pedal C, which is theoretically there, but most players can't do that. I remember on your old site you mentioned that bass trumpets are good for being the evil counterpart to the horn's nobility. Is there a combination you could use with horn to simulate this effect? You mean horn plus bass trumpet? I mean, yeah. The bass trumpet can go anywhere from being heroic if played in the mid to upper register, particularly the really upper register. Down in the low range, bass trumpet can really get sinister, particularly if it's got a straight mute in. Listen to Rite of Spring, the bass trumpet solo in that. It's just this cutting, piercing sound through there, and it works. Muted horn plus bass trumpet, plus muted bass trumpet, yeah. I haven't played in 25 years, but I could get down to that pedal C, but sometimes struggled with getting out all the notes around it. Yeah, and so this is something I talk about in Volume 3. I talk about that pedal C, and there's a chart in the beginning in Chapter 1 or Chapter 2 where I talk about the pedal notes, and I put a list. These instruments can play the pedal note, these instruments can't. And one thing that I write is B-flat horn can play the pedal note. F horn can't, parentheses, except by some players. I kind of play horn, and I can't play pedal C, but I also don't have a double horn to get to it by step. Astro, I wouldn't worry about getting out that pedal C. Composers don't write for it. When I interviewed a horn player several years ago, he told me that the lowest note he had ever seen written was actually a D flat. So half a step above that. And that was for professional players, and that would still be on the B flat side of the horn. So was that thumb 2 3? Yeah, thumb 2 3. And there are certain players out there. If you go listen to Sarah Willis, fourth horn for the Berlin Phil, her low range is just the most beautiful low range I've ever heard. I also have like a serious internet crush on her, so there's that. I could play a concert F scale in 4 octaves, but not in clean eighth notes. Yeah, that's a 4 octave F scale on a horn would be pretty difficult. All right, so somebody mentioned earlier a low B flat horn. And this is an interesting thing. It's something I have never understood why there has not been a bass horn pitched either a fourth or a fifth lower. So probably B flat would be kind of the thing you'd want to look at, because B flat basso was a really common crook in the classical era. When we were doing Mozart's Grand Partita, most of horns 3 and 4 parts were B flat basso. I've tried a single F horn once and found that the lowest fundamental toe with all 3 notes down is between B0 and C1, but that note is impractical. Well, yeah, the lowest theoretical note, it should be a B0, but that's below the range of what it should be able to do. It's not designed to do that. Anyway, so on to a bass horn. So there have been accounts throughout the years of such instruments. In the book, I talk about the horns 7 and 8, or is it 6 and 8? I can't remember which numbers it is, but it's in Bruckner's 8th Symphony as well as his 9th Symphony. So it's the lowest 2 horn parts, whether it's 7 and 8 or 6 and 8. I can't remember off the top of my head. Anyway, these horns are written for a B flat basso valve horn. And it's the only time in the literature I can find such an occurrence. And I've asked horn players, I've asked horn scholars, what's going on here? And there's not a good answer. It could be Bruckner would have known the Vienna horn system, which still has a removable crook with the valves. So it could be that there was a crook that they put in, and that different valve slides. But we don't know. We don't really have much evidence of such an instrument. Now, modern day, a few bass horns have been made, or contrabass horns. There's the Roger Bobo instrument that's in C. It's a 4-valve. There's a couple B-flat instruments that have been made, but every one of those instruments is basically a rewrapped tuba in some form or another. And they all use tuba mouthpieces. And in that regard, they really lose a lot of their affinity toward the horns. What I would love to see is a true bass horn built with exact horn dimensions, just scaled up, and a true horn mouthpiece. And the true horn mouthpiece would have to be machined and turned and made to their exact specifications, but it could be done. Now, imagine this. You have your section of, you'd probably want a section of 8 horns. Horns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on normal double horns. And then horns 7 and 8 on these much bigger B-flat basso horns. If you think about that, that would be an impressive, meaty section. And you might also want to have it where the players can double back and forth. What you don't want to have is an instrument that is so big that it can only be played by a tuba player. Yeah, B-flat horn would carry the strong range below middle C a bit lower without having the embouchure break of playing pedal notes. I've seen Mythosphere on YouTube's instruments. Mythosphere is more of a instrument builder than a performer. He's had some really interesting instruments come through his collection. I'm not entirely sold on the bass horn he built. because it still really is a tuba. Well, or it's tuba like it. You would really need a true brass manufacturer to do it, and you wouldn't want to do it out of spare parts. And this is where it would get much more difficult. You would really need to build um, a, a giant mandrels to do it. Would a contrabass horn in F one octave lower be useful? Not really, no. Because that size of an instrument would be the same length as an F subcontrabass tuba. So you're talking an instrument 24 feet in length just for the open bugle. Before you add any valves, it gets to an impractical size and impractical weight. It's just simply too big. And I don't think it would not solve any need. Because down there you've already got the tuba that can fill in those extra low notes. I really want to learn how to make instruments so I can make all the ones I want. Yeah, me too. Agreed. A horn with any other instrument's mouthpiece is not a horn. Yes. And, you've got to, you just have to scale up the horn mouthpiece. And it's the mouthpiece that makes such a huge difference in tone on brass instruments. Is that also true with a piccolo horn? So right now, the piccolo horns that are out there, and there are plenty of them out there because they're cheap, they're toys right now. I could see a creative composer, a creative performer using them, but they really do fit the niche more of just being a toy. And so they don't really serve a need. The descant horn does that well enough. And the descant horn is a horn pitched one octave above the regular F horn. Would the bore bell size on a B-flat bass horn be different than an F horn? It should be. Yes, it should be actually considerably bigger. So a typical horn would have about a 10-inch bell. If you really wanted to do a B-flat bass horn, you'd probably want something like a 12 to even 14-inch terrible... I'm reading and trying to talk at the same time. A 12 to 14-inch bell on that bass horn. You also want the throat small enough, though, that you can get a hand in it to stop. And here you do get into some acoustical issues. So yeah, you've got to make it big enough, but not too big. And there's just a lot of detail you'd have to go through. But it would be something fun for an experimental instrument maker. If I could ever get in good with some of the brass makers out there, that's that and that alto euphonium. That would be all overriding these massive low bass horn parts. Okay. So let's talk numbers of players for band settings. Typically, every major band piece will have 4 horn parts. That's so typical. A lot of times, though, horns 3 and 4 are written in such a way that they can be left out if you don't have the players, because composers are like, oh, but are they going to have horns 3 and 4? Are they not going to have horns 3 and 4? Let's just write crap parts. And so their parts are there, but they're just crap. But above 4 horn parts in band music tends to actually be quite rare. I believe Bob Margolis's Terpsichore actually calls for 5. And what I think is actually going on is American bands and orchestras tend to actually use 5 players to cover 4 parts. The 5th player is called a bumper, and they double the first horn just to give the first horn player a bit of a break. European orchestras do not use the bumper. They say if you're paid to play first horn, you're playing first horn. You don't get an assistant, and so they don't follow that tradition there. But what Bob Margolis did in Terpsichore is he added that 5th horn in and just scored for it in such a way that it interweaves. Above that, though, I don't know any pieces that call for more than 5 horns. 6 horns would not be unreasonable. I score for 6 horns in my Symphony Number 2. 6 horns is also the standard that's used in Holst's Planets and one of the Mahler symphonies, and I cannot remember which. It's not one. It's not. It's most of 2. It's most of 2, where he uses 6 horns, and then he brings in another 4 in the end. I think that's right. Yeah. So, 6 horns would be interesting for wind band music. For a larger college band, it would not be terribly difficult to get 6 horns. High schools would be more difficult, but I know high schools that could do it. And then you go up to 8. Horns, by the way, are almost always scored for in pairs. Odd numbers of horns are surprisingly difficult to find. In fact, in the standard orchestral literature, there's only one piece of music that calls for 7 horns. And that's Mahler's First Symphony. It's 7 horns throughout. And there's a single piece in the repertoire that calls for 5 horns, and a handful that call for 3 horns. But it's almost always 2, 4, 6, or 8. So they almost always come in pairs. 8 horns in a wind band would be powerful, and I would love to see that happen. Never played in or saw a band with too many horns. Well, is there such a thing as too many horns? There's the question. I know that the University of Michigan in their giant band uses 8. University of Michigan is an interesting group, and then that they are really the last of the giant Midwest school bands, concert bands, that basically double every part, and they are regularly on stage with about 90 players. But yeah, 8 horns in a wind ensemble, wind band, would be interesting. And it's at that point, once you get to that level of 8, that you can start talking about Wagner tuba. And I guess we'll just kind of go into Wagner tuba. Tuben. By the way, so here's a nomenclature thing. Wagner tuba is 1. Wagner tuben is more than 1. This is the only case where we use the German ending, Tuben. The en ending is basically just like adding an s in English. And we use that term to differentiate Wagner Tuben from tubas, because they're not the same. And it a lot of times, particularly in Hollywood recording studios, they will call Tuben and then tubas. So Tuben, tubas, horns or giant bugles. Oddly, something with the Wagner Tuben that you will never see in the traditional scores that call for them, including Wagner, Bruckner, Strauss, Stravinsky, Schoenberg. Not a single one of them call them Wagner. They don't use the term Wagner. It's just tuba or tuben. And it's only later that the term Wagner gets applied to them. Of course, because Wagner caused these instruments to be incorporated into the orchestra and basically invented them, kind of. Okay, so let's actually talk about the invention of it, because it's stealing from stealing. So we'll start with Wagner. Wagner wanted a sound that would bridge the horns and the trombones and be able to be played by the horns using a horn mouthpiece. And to that effect, he had the company Moritz. By the way, Moritz also invented the tuba itself, along with Vprecht. Vprecht and Moritz. It's sometime I will do a video bio on Vprecht if I ever get around to it. Most neglected figure in wind band history. These instruments were made by the Moritz company. And subsequently, most of them had been made by Alexander. But where did Wagner get this idea from? He got it from Adolf Sax. And Adolf Sax had his sax horns. And Wagner particularly wanted an alto sax horn and a bass sax horn. The bass sax horn is, of course, the euphonium, and the alto sax horn, well, okay, so alto sax horn here is interesting. The alto sax horn doesn't exist. The alto horn that we know is an alto saxo tromba. Wagner knew that instrument. The alto or tenor saxo tromba in E flat is the instrument Wagner wanted to play the bass trumpet part in the ring. But Wagner also wanted an alto sax horn. Sax never made an alto sax horn. So where did Sax get the idea from to make these instruments? We got to go back to, Vprecht and Moritz again. So if we come full circle, Vprecht and Moritz invent the tuba, and then eventually the euphonium, and do some other stuff with that. Adolf Sax steals their idea, claims to create a whole family of them. Wagner sees these instruments, says, our German makers can do it better. Goes back to Moritz. I think by this time Vprecht had died, and says, make me these instruments. Hello, welcome. So, yeah. So these are the Wagner Tuben. And they have, as far as I know, never been used in the wind band. I have a couple of dissertations on the history of the Wagner tuba, and through both of those dissertations, there's mention of one piece that calls for them. And here is what I know about that piece. It's Alfred Reed's In Memoriam. And it's a piece of Alfred Reed's that may never have been recorded. I don't even know if it's ever been played. I've got the score to it because I found it fairly cheap. It's in print, but nobody knows it. Nobody plays it. And so I got it, and there's no Wagner tuba in it. But the sketches in the dissertation clearly show that there are Wagner tubas in the original sketch. So what I'm thinking is that Alfred Reed scored for them and then later just wrote out the part entirely. And the published version is completely different than the original manuscript. Now, it used to be that Wagner tuben were essentially out of the range of what a wind band composer or wind band performer could do, because these are instruments that are, first off, they're typically bought in a quartet. So you buy 4 Wagner tubas at once. And you buy them all as a match set, and it's going to run you about $50,000 for the set, because each one's $10,000 to $12,000. Helicopter, would the descant B flat, F, and bass horns have the same relationship as the soprano, alto, tenor, and baritone saxophones? No. And the reason for that is the B flat and the F horns have the exact same inner dimensions, just different lengths. Some descant horns will have that same inner dimension. Some will be made smaller. As for bass horn, we're talking theoretical there. So it does not correspond to your saxophones. So anyway, Correct. B flat and F horn parts are not written distinctly. It's the player chooses what they're using. Some players will use single B flat horns. Dennis Brain was the classic example. The great British horn soloist. He, toward the end of his career, played a single B flat for everything. So anyway, back to the Wagner tuba. You buy a set. It's $50,000. And, you know, when Bank of Buzzers, no thanks, we're not using that. That's too expensive. That's the same price you would pay for 2 concert series for a professional orchestra. You could buy these 4 instruments that you would use like once. However, in the past 10 years, we have Chinese Wagner tubas. A phrase 20 years ago, you would laugh at. Oh yeah, we'll have Chinese Wagner tubas that you can buy for $850, and they're going to be good, and you would be laughed at and run out of town, and yeah. But here's the thing: we now have these Chinese clones, and they're actually not even clones. They're actually an individual, unique design. So there's cheap Wagner tubas. Tom, sorry about the notification. I had to start the stream about 5 times before it would start, and I ended up even having to start 20 minutes late. Yeah, from what I've read, they are supposed to be really decent instruments. Here's the thing, though, with the Chinese Wagner tubas. They are double tubas. In that they're supposed to be able to function as both a B flat and an F Wagner tuba, just depending on where you put your thumb, just like a double horn. The thing is, the Wagner tubas are made in 2 sizes: the B flat tenor and the F bass. The Wessex or the Chinese Wagner tubas are built along the B flat tenor proportions, and yes, they will have the second set of slides to play the F side, but they're not built along the F tuba's proportions. So you can use the Chinese Wagner tubas really well for your tenor Wagner tuba parts, your B flat Wagner tubas. And this is actually what gets used most often on the Hollywood soundstage. Pretty much everything in the Hollywood soundstage are these double Wagner tubas. So the players will just pick it up and play it just like they play the regular horn. But that's not what Wagner, Bruckner, Strauss, Schoenberg all wanted. They wanted 2 distinct sounds. So the lighter tenor sound and then the big heavy bass Wagner tuba. And so there's not a cheap Chinese equivalent to the bass Wagner tuba in F yet. I have heard rumors, and I will even say where I heard this rumor. I saw a comment from Jonathan Hodgetts, who owns Wessex Tubas, that they are in development of a F bass Wagner tuba. That my guess, if they develop it, it won't break the bank, and it would probably be in the $2,000 range, I would bet. And that would get you your extra low notes. Something you may have seen, there is a great video. Tim Davies put out a series of videos where he talked to horn player Jim Thatcher, and he talked about playing the Wagner tuba. So, and he said, you can't go as low as you can on the horn, because he's using a double tuba there. He's not using an F bass. If you're using an F bass tuba, though, that extra low range really opens up, and you theoretically should be able to go easily down to sounding G below the bass clef. Would it be reasonable to score for just two Tuben, one in B flat, one in F? Um, if you're going to do it, so this opens up a whole interesting story here. Typically, you score for them in four. There's no reason you couldn't, though. There is one standard score that calls for two B-flat tenor Wagner tubas and no F basses. And that's Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. So horns 7 and 8 go over to Wagner tuba. And it is two B-flats. Fine, easy. One of the issues there is notation, and for a long time, nobody was sure if it's sounding down a second or sounding down a ninth. But the current scholarship says, yes, it's down a second, which is the standard way of writing them now. To do one in B flat and one in F, yeah, I don't see why you couldn't. Horn players are going to argue with me on this, and horn players will say, write all Wagner tuba parts in F no matter what. Which is absolutely fine if you're writing for the double Wagner tubas that they use in Hollywood. However, if you are really wanting to score for the tenor Wagner tubas and the bass Wagner tubas, it really does need to be in B flat and in F to make sure that you have that sound difference. Horn players may argue me on that. And I will listen to their arguments, and we'll probably go back and forth, and neither one of us will come away satisfied at the end, because I'm still going to write for B flats and Fs, and they're still going to ask me to write for all Fs. So, but Aster, I would first, I would suggest if you're going to write for two Wagner tuba, just write two parts in F and be done with it. I think that's what your horn players will like more. And chances are they will be the double tubas. Interestingly, so the double tubas are very preferred on Hollywood. In the big orchestras, though, they absolutely want to use the B flats and the Fs. The doubles can be used on the upper parts for the B flats, but the Fs have just got to be these much, much bigger instruments. And Wagner's scoring for the F tubas, he's really scoring for them very, very low. That would not sound good on the double Wagner tubas. He takes them down all the way, I think the lowest he goes is a sounding B flat below the bass clef. And that just is really too low for what the Wessex instrument is, the double. But that said, because of these Wessex instruments, the Chinese instruments, band composers should be really looking at these instruments very carefully and say, I could start calling for Wagner tuba. It would be really cool to start seeing some band music call for Wagner tuba. In an old textbook I have, it talks about there was a time when some Prussian bands tried using Wagner tuba. That's Prussia, not Russia. But I'm not sure whatever came of that. Yeah, I would have preferred everything written on the same transposition and written range as a regular horn, but I never got to play in an ensemble with Tuben. I understand that. Yeah, so the horn player wants to just see everything standard. But if you are writing for two distinct instruments, it makes sense to write for those two distinct instruments in two distinct ways. By the way, perhaps the most confusing thing in all of organology, the study of musical instruments, is Wagner tuba notation. It is insanely complicated because Richard Wagner had no clue what he was doing. He was going by the seat of his pants. If you look at Das Rheingold, it's very clear that he's still scoring for the idea of alto and bass sax horns, E flat and B flat instruments. So Das Rheingold is all E flat and B flat all the way through. and, and then you look at it, but these are being played on a B flat and on an F instrument. So they each have to transpose. And so that's terrible. He fixes it midway through Die Valkyrie. Die Valkyrie or Siegfried? One of them. I can't remember. So one opera is split in half. Half of it's B flat and E flat, half of it's B flat and F. And then there's the case, do you write the B flat instrument a second lower, or do you write the B flat instrument a ninth lower? Do you write the F instrument a fifth lower, or do you write the F instrument a 12th lower? And so you go through, and these scores don't tell you. You have to start assuming, which is why Rite of Spring is difficult to interpret. Bruckner's scores are difficult to interpret. Schoenberg, in his Girl Leader, scores for 10 horns. The last 4 of them, so horns 7, 8, 9, and 10, all double on Wagner tuba. And he writes for them in B flat tenor and E flat bass. No, E flat tenor and B flat bass. Yeah. And it's like, why did you do that? You followed Wagner, and you knew that nearly 30 years after that those instruments didn't exist. So, I mean, it would be more reasonable for players to have the Wessex, especially in a non-professional band. Yes. And the only places that you will see the professional instruments are going to be in your top-tier symphony orchestras. And so, yeah, you don't see... Until the Wessex instruments came out, you did not see any individuals owning their own Wagner tuba. It just was not a thing. They were all institutionally owned instruments. So a personally, privately owned Wagner tuba wasn't in existence until about 10 years ago. It's absolutely fascinating that you have this instrument that is in some major core pieces in the literature, but no players would own it. Now, players are owning it, and you're starting to see a lot more scholarship take place, a lot more study of the instrument take place. So I foresee probably in the next 10 years that we'll start seeing band composers really start taking notice of this. Hopefully. All right. So I've been going an hour. It's 9 o'clock now. I'll start wrapping it up. So you guys have any questions, comments? So looks like I've got a bunch of emails come in, so I'll have to answer those here in just a little bit. And again, sorry for the delay tonight. I do not know what's going on with my internet connection, but gotta love it. I'm sure the coffee is just ice cold now. With the B flat and F horns having the same bore, is that the same as the bore of the B flat clarinet and basset horn? No. Helicopter, you can't really think of woodwind instruments and brass instruments functioning the same. It is they just function on different physical properties. Why is it that Tuben have a more restricted range than horns? Theoretically, they don't. In practice, they do. The upper range is more difficult because the instrument is wider bore. Horns are able to play up as high as they can because the bore is somewhat more restricted. It just allows for the higher partials to come out easier. The Wagner Tuben, with their little bit wider bore, it becomes more difficult. Low range, the low range is not as restricted as it's made out to be. Jim Thatcher was saying the low range is limited, but he's using what's essentially the B flat tenor instrument. He's not using the big F instrument. if we were using the big F instrument, yeah, the low range keeps going down quite a bit. Next week's instrument, cornets and sax horns. But still, if you talk about limited range, I mean, there's still a 3-octave range on the instruments. That's more than any other brass instrument other than the horn has. So, and you don't really need Wagner Tuben going way up into the stratosphere. I mean, the highest I ever wrote is the F. I think I've scored for Wagner Tuba once in Symphony 3, and I think both the B flat and the F Wagner tuba both go up to a written G above the treble clef. The bass Wagner tuba, the F Wagner tubas, I think stay in bass clef most of the time. And so, yeah, that's a good range for them. The B flat Wagner tuba will stay in bass clef quite a bit, but I have them in treble too. So even like 75%, 25% bass clef for that. F alto Wagner tuba. It's never been done. You would need a need for it first before you would want to have that instrument. And I don't know. I don't know if you would need an F alto Wagner tuba. How much larger is the F contrabass trombone's bore and bell diameter compared to a B flat bass? It's a lot bigger than you think it is, Helicopter. When I was doing the photography on the trombones, the player there had, it was fantastic. He had on his wall a soprano, an alto, 3 different kinds of tenors, a bass, and a contrabass. And you could really tell how much bigger the contrabass is. Wider bore, bigger throat. It is substantially bigger. That said, I still want an F or G bass trombone to make a comeback. But, you know, that's wishful thinking there because players will never want it. Descant Tuben. Could be a thing, probably won't be a thing. Man, somebody in here needs to start learning how to make brass instruments. It's dinner time for me. Yeah, I'm going to cook some pasta here too myself. So, if there are no more questions, guys, we will go ahead and end this one for the night.